Hi friends, Tracy here from the Sewing Channel. You're not going to believe today's tutorial. I had an absolute blast making this quilt coat. So here's the deal. I don't use a quilt to make this quilt coat. I use vintage feedsack fabric from an eBay haul that I did a while ago. I share with you tons of tips in today's tutorial so that you can make a quilt coat too. The last step, hem the bottom of this coat. I'll meet you at the end for a final reveal of this coat that I cannot believe that I just made. Enough talking already. Let's get busy making a quilt coat together.
So a while ago, I purchased this little pack bundle of feedsack fabric off of eBay. I paid over $200 for this little pack of fabric in purples and blues and greens and pinks and yellows. At the time when I bought this fabric, I was really fascinated by feedsack fabric. I had no idea what I was going to use it on, what kind of project, if it's going to be a quilt or an apron or whatever. So after I did that haul video, I tucked the fabric aside and thought, well, I'll deal with that another day when something comes up and I want to use this fabric. Well, today's the day, friends. I started processing a few pieces at the beginning and it got really stringy. By processing, I mean washing it by hand and throwing it in the dryer. I mean, this fabric is really old, so I wanted to make sure it got washed. Well, it wasn't going to work with those first few pieces, so I pinked all the edges of all of the other fabrics. And then I washed them, and that really helped. There was no stringies and nothing like that, so it worked out great. You can see here in the water that there is some dirtiness to the water, some grayish color, but it really wasn't that bad. And I washed them in small batches with like a Tide or something like that. You know, it was just a regular laundry soap. And I did use really warm water too, because anything I make for myself or my family, I make sure that it's going to be able to handle warm to hot water and a run through the dryer. I've never been a fussy launderer by any means. If it can't be done in warm to hot water and thrown in the dryer, then I don't want it. So here are some pieces that just came fresh out of the dryer, and I'm opening them up and I'm going to put some starch spray on them and then press them out with a dry iron. After processing all of the fabric, I did check to see the difference after processing, and I think mostly the pinking is what brought it down in size. They started out at 5-inch by 8-inch rectangles, and you know, just slightly under that after processing all of the fabric. I knew I wanted to stabilize the backs of this fabric because I didn't know how well it was going to hold up. I mean, it was really old fabric. So I put this fusible stretch interfacing, so to speak, on the backs of the fabric. Now I should have just did the entire 5x8 piece of fabric, but I thought I was only going to be getting 4.5-inch squares out of the pieces, and I didn't think I was going to use all the fabric up, but more on that later. This interfacing will not only protect the fabric's integrity, it will help us work with the fabric a lot easier than if it didn't have it. It would be kind of floppy and flimsy, but with it, it's nice and sturdy and firm, and it's really easy to cut, and it's really easy to sew. You can really use any type of interfacing that you may just have on hand. I really like the Pellon one. It has like a stretch to it. It's fusible on the one side. I don't know, I tend to go toward that one, but any interfacing will do. My 4.5-inch squares nicely cut and ready to use. If you don't know me that well, I hate patterns. I never use them, but for this project, I needed a pattern because there was no way I was making up a full-on coat pattern from scratch. So I cut out what I needed and I grabbed some muslin because you know I'm doing a mock-up because I have no idea how this is going to turn out. So I made my mock-up. Here it is here, and I knew I wanted not to use the cuffs in the pattern, so I needed to make the arms longer. So I knew that, and you know, yeah, that's my mock-up. Pretty good, right? The one thing I did learn while making the mock-up is I need a medium, not a small. The small is what I made the mock-up in. And so I upped my size by 1, and I ended up ultimately making it in the medium. So I had a ton of white flannel on hand, so that is what I used for the lining of my quilt coat. I figured it would make it, super cozy too. Now the hardest thing in this whole project was the neck area. Because I wanted that shawl type collar, I, went with this pattern, and I had never done that before, and I don't make clothes ever, so I have really no clue what I'm doing. So I had to look up a ton of tutorials on how to make a shawl collar, because the instructions in the pattern, they might as well have kept them, really. I don't understand pattern directions ever, so yeah. So after about 5 tutorials, different ones, mind you, on how to sew a shawl collar, I had it and I was good to go. And so, when I have it, then I give it to you all. So more on that shawl collar business later, because I think I have it down to a science now. So if I ever have to make it again, I'm ready. Now the shawl collar, that was one of the main reasons why I purchased the pattern that I did, because of the way it laid on the neck and around onto the shoulder area and down to the front. It just looked like a real timeless type, design, I guess. I don't know. So now we have it in the size medium, but this is not the mock-up. This is the real deal. This is the lining that is going to go in my quilt coat. So I'm just checking, the sleeve area, because remember I had told you with the first mock-up it needed to be, a longer length on the sleeve. So I did that, and it seems a little big, but I'm going to trust the process. You'll probably notice too, one side of the lining is longer than the other side, and I'm not sure how that happened really. I'm really not sure. It even happened with the pattern piece too, for the actual quilt coat. But luckily for me, the shorter piece was still, okay in length for what I needed. The next step was to cut out all of the cotton batting pieces that I needed to make the quilt coat. And after that, then it was time to lay out all of my beautiful feedsack fabric squares onto that quilt batting, so that way I could see how it was going to fit. Now I knew I wanted to put all of my squares on point. For all of my new quilters out there, all on point means is that you take the square and you turn it so that the point is facing up, so it looks like you have a diamond square. And that's how I wanted it to land on my quilt coat. I realized real quick that positioning my squares this way on my quilt coat was going to cost more fabric. Because of the way that it's positioned, you use up more fabric. That's just the way it is. So once I figured out where the squares were going to go, I then sewed them in rows at an angle, like you can see me picking up some of the strips there. And, and that's how I just kind of laid them on the pattern piece. And then I would lift up the actual tissue paper pattern piece, like you see me doing right here, and laying that on top to see how much more fabric I would need, around the edges and such. Because the actual quilt batting I made a little bit bigger than the actual pattern piece, because I was going to quilt on it. And whenever you quilt something, it tends to shrink up. Now remember those cutoffs from when I first cut the 5x8 inch rectangle? I didn't, put the fusible over the whole thing. There was a piece left. Well, those pieces I took, sewed those together, and I made little 4 patches out of those. So within my quilt coat, there are, several other little scraps, and, I really didn't want all those areas to be random like that, but it is what it is. I ended up having to really scrap this quilt coat together in the end, because it was becoming very evident that I did not have enough fabric, not enough at all. But if I used the tiny scraps, then I did. So I kind of, had to make a new design choice throughout the quilt coat. Now, for sake of boredom, I'm definitely not going to show you all of these pattern pieces in the way I did it. So let's just concentrate on just one of the arm pieces, and we can work through that so I can show you how I processed this as I went. So once all of the strips were sewn on and everything was totally connected all together and everything lined up real good with the tissue and all that, then it was time to get out my 505 spray and spray that quilt top, so to speak, onto the cotton batting. Now remember, I had to lengthen the sleeve, so that's why there's no tissue paper covering that bottom part. Just a reminder. So after we spray it, we're not going to trim it just yet. We first have to, do some stitching on it because it is a quilt coat. Now, you could totally do free motion quilting on this. Totally. I love free motion quilting. But I did decide to do some straight line quilting. So once this is all fused on here and, you spread it really good with your hands, then the next step is going to be to put some stitch lines, some quilt design of some sort onto your quilt sandwich. So here we go with some straight line quilting. I just positioned myself so that the edge of my presser foot was going down the middle of the ditch, and so it was stitching about 1/8 of an inch, next to the seam, and so on and so forth on the other side of that seam as well. And I kind of kept up that whole design element in the entire quilt coat. It made things much easier, and I felt like a robot, though. I don't know. I think that's why I like free motion quilting so much, because you get so creative with it. But I like this one too, though. Now that all of the straight line quilting was done, it's time to add in any tiny spots that are missing along the edge. All I did was pin the pattern on and then recheck to make sure, where I needed maybe a little corner or a little piece. And I was sure to take care of that right then and there. And you can see me cutting off of the top of this area here on this armhole and taking that and putting it somewhere else because it just worked. And since I was low on fabric, I was stealing from every, corner I could. So after all of those, little tiny spots were all sewn on and taken care of, then it was time to really pin this pattern piece on real good. Along all the edges is best, and maybe a couple in the center. And grab a sharp pair of scissors and then just start to cut around this pattern piece. So I am using scissors, as you can see there. I'm not using my rotary cutter like I normally would. I feel like I just have more control with the scissors when dealing with patterns and pieces like this. I am lengthening the arm area here and just using my ruler and just cutting pretty much straight down at an angle almost. And here is one of our arms. Isn't it pretty? Oh my word, it's just so pretty. It's important to note that I never cut that end part down by the wrist until the very end of the whole project. I do the same thing with the bottom of the quilt coat. You never know what could happen, so I don't cut into that until the end. As I was moving along in this project, I was well aware still I was running out of this feedsack fabric, and I wanted the whole quilt coat to be feedsack. So I, grabbed anything I could, even the littlest, tiniest pieces, as you can see here, and I just made it work somehow. I don't know how, but I did. Here's a close-up shot of me putting those straight line quilt stitches within one of the pieces. I'm not sure which one. So this next thing I wanted to share with you was the folded piece. Now on the pattern piece it says, that you need to fold your fabric. Well, in this case we have almost like a quilt top. It's very thick. Luckily I was able to fix this mistake after I made it. Because I was using a bulky quilt top, so to speak, it added a little bit more. As you can see here, that red mark is the dead center of my piece. And you can see how far my pattern piece is from that. There was about a little more than 1/8 of an inch difference. And that is not going to work when we're trying to do a shawl collar. So I had to shift that pattern piece on the already cut piece that I just cut, shift it down into the side and recut it. Luckily, things were saved and I still had correct measurements. So you just needed to shift and make sure that you knew ahead of time that you needed to do that. Now, I'm not going to lie. Once I had everything up on my design wall, I'm laughing about it right now, but that looks like a clown show up there. For real, I'm just saying. I don't know. I'm praying that I change my mind by the end of making it. Now that all of the pieces are nicely cut out perfectly, it's time to sew both side seams up. You're going to lay the left front piece on and pin all along the side seam, and you're going to want to do the same on the right side. Once everything is pinned securely, then you're going to sew a honkin', and I mean a honkin' 5/8 inch down the sides of this quilt coat. On all the seams really on this quilt coat. And I say a honkin' because that is the biggest seam I've ever sewn in my life. Why so big? I'm a quilter. I'm a 1/4 inch quilter. That's what I am. I am no 5/8 inch. If you've ever sewn a 5/8 inch seam allowance, you know what I'm talking about. But anyways, so after you sew those, you're going to give it a good hot press. The next few minutes we are going to put toward the shawl collar. Take along that top piece, the shoulder seam, and pin. Now we're going to make some dots. And now they are on your pattern piece. You'll want to grab that and you'll want to grab a marking tool. Do not leave this step out. You have to put the dots. Just lay your pattern piece down and mark it. And on all not 4 pieces, 3 pieces, but 4 dots. So on the back panel, you're going to have 2 dots. And on each of the side pieces, front pieces, you'll have 2 dots, so 4 altogether. Take a pin, pop it through, and mark that area with a marking tool. And you're going to want to do that on all 4 sides. Very important. So you've pinned the shoulders, and now you've made all 4 marks that are on your pattern piece. Very important. Pop a pin from the front piece to the back piece to that dot that's right next to it, and pin those 2 dots together. And you're going to want to do that on the left and the right. Now sew from one shoulder to the dot and the other shoulder to the dot a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And you can see there I'm all sewn up. I've already sewn it, and I've sewn up to the dot on both sides. That's it, to the dot only. Now grab those 2 back neck pieces. They kind of look like squares almost, and connect them together, pin those, and sew a 5/8 seam allowance. Even sounds funny saying 5/8, right? Come on. Once that's all sewn, then open that seam allowance up and give it a good hot press. Now you should have a hole from that area until the neck area. It's like a big gaping hole there. So now it's time to sew that up. But before we can sew that, we need to cut a big notch straight to that dot from where that L shape, kind of area is there. That's going to loosen up that neck area so we can even sew it. It acts like a hinge, so to speak, once we get things going here. It's also important to note that once you get the pins and everything in there, you see I'm trying to get everything flush there at the neck area. That V-shaped area where we cut into, that is going to be stretched. That is meant to do that. So you're going to have that big V gap there. So just so you know, I mean, I got confused with that, but so I figure everyone else would be confused too. So that's why I'm just letting you know. And once you get that all pinned, then you're going to start from one dot and sew to the other dot. And once you do that, be sure and backstitch though. Once you do that, look at this beautiful collar that this technique gives you. I mean, it really is amazing. It's the first time I've ever done it, and I have to say, looks pretty good. I don't know. So here's a shot of the inside, and it looks just as good as the outside, right? I know, come on. These little squares right here are actually gifts from the seller. When I first purchased all of my feed sacks together, they threw this in as like a little bonus. Well, I wanted to do my pockets on point, but I didn't even have enough of the freebies. So I had to turn all my squares, properly. I had this really cute piece of newspaper print fabric from Zen Chic, and I thought that would be perfect to line the back of this quilt pocket. I did make the lining fabric a bit bigger because I knew I wanted a little overhang on that top portion of the pocket. Once everything's said and done, there'll be a tiny piece of newsprint peeking out. So I did put a memory crease in after I folded everything together and laid the batting in. I then took my 505 spray once again and adhered the batting only to that back of the pocket. Then I refold everything back up just to make sure that I'm right on track with what I would actually like peeking out of that pocket. Then I only added some straight line quilting to the batting and the front of the pocket first. Doing that first just attaches those two pieces together. And then in the magic of editing, you're going to see I did some straight line quilting. And then after that, then you're going to turn things right sides together and pin the top, putting a reverse crease, memory crease, into your fabric in the top there so that you have that first initial positioned fabric where you wanted it, so it stays. Trim off any excess at this point. Remember, I only had a little bit of extra because I wasn't sure, how much I was going to show on the top and whatnot. Press a hem in the bottom of the pocket. This will, enable us to turn our work right side out when we're done, and it will lay really nice when we go to close it up. Pop some pins in the side and a couple in the corners in the bottom there, and then just sew a 1/4 inch seam around, leaving that opening. Yes, I said a 1/4 inch seam. This is probably the only time you're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam in this project. Now turn your pocket right side out and then push the corners out with a pokey tool if you have one, and then give everything a good hot press, making sure to roll out all of those seams. So after this, I did add some more top stitching on the front to make it look really nice, but then I did end up washing these by hand and throwing them in the dryer because when they were tiny squares, there was no way to wash it. I had to wait until this step, and I wanted my whole coat to be all clean. Okay, set those aside and let's get back to the quilt coat construction. Here I am modeling this lovely vest with no sleeves, and yeah, no, definitely needs sleeves. We are not keeping it like this, friends. And yes, one side is definitely longer than the other, and like I said earlier in the video, I'm not sure how I did that, but I did do it. I don't know. But now on to position where we're going to put these pockets, because I'm going to do this right now before I even attempt the sleeves. So you can see here, there was so much science involved in where I place these pockets. Yeah, right. So I just stood there and, kind of put my hand where I thought it would land. And then I simply just pinned the one side and sewed that on. I did reinforce the bottom of those pockets with an extra stitch line, and I reinforced at the top of the pocket where that gets a lot of pushing and shoving and a lot of wear right there. And hopefully
you know, that stays pretty good. I think it will. Here I'm just measuring to make sure that I have the other pocket situated exactly like the first pocket, because, you know, we don't want crooked pockets now, do we? No. Now I did slant the pockets. That is intentional. So I want to make sure I put that in there. I like that slant there because, you know, your hand goes in better, right? I don't know. Let's tackle these armholes. Now friends, this information you need to know, and I could not find it in the pattern anywhere. You see that dip in that pattern piece right there? That dip always goes in the front. Now they don't tell you that, but you need to know that. Otherwise you're going to be all crazy up in your shoulder. So you need to know the dip in the pattern piece when it is folded goes toward the front. Okay, enough said there. Once everything is pinned, then you're going to take it to your sewing machine and you're going to sew what they say is less than a 5/8 inch. It's just under a 5/8 inch seam allowance. It's an 1/8 of an inch under a 5/8 seam allowance. Because once you sew around that with that seam allowance, then you go another 1/8 inch seam allowance. Per the directions anyways. I don't know. They wrote it. I definitely followed it because I don't want any wonky shoulder stuff happening on me. No. So after those 2 stitch lines, then you need to cut a bunch of notches around this armhole area. Now cutting these notches is very important because you want everything to lay properly at the shoulder area. So I really did pay attention to their instructions on that. Anyways, those particular instructions. Now I did top stitch around that shoulder seam area here on the outside, and I don't know if the pattern said to do that or not, but I think it looked really nice. Here's a good shot of that top stitching all along that shoulder area. I really think it makes a huge difference. So now it's time for me to connect this all together to see if everything is going to lay how it should lay. So I'm just shoving my lining into the actual quilt coat and just checking to make sure, you know, just how everything is. I don't want any ripples and, you know, I just want to make sure there's no issues. Once I think everything is good to go, then I put right sides together, pushing, you know, the armhole in the opposite way and matching everything up, matching the collar first and pinning, and then I do pin all along the side. And what I'm going to do is stitch almost to the end on the side and across the top and down the other side, but I'm not going to go all the way down yet on the sides. After that's all sewn together, then it's time to figure out what length do I want these arm sleeves. Oh my word, finally. So I did try the coat on again and figured out, you know, the sleeve length. I made a mark and then I went about a 1/4 inch past that mark, or 1/2 inch, I think, 1/2 inch it was. And then I cut, because whatever was left, that 1/2 inch, I was going to tuck in and make a hem right there and then. I didn't, you know, do any fancy turn right side out, inside out kind of stuff. I know there's a method for it and my brain was not going to go there. So I just tucked it and that's how I sewed it. But I did give it a good press and put a bunch of pins in before I sewed. As a side note for the cuffs, I did end up making 2 stitch lines for top stitch around that cuff area on both of the cuffs. I just thought it ended up looking really cute. So all I've done here is taken the bottom of the outside, shoved all of the coat inside, and lifted up the lining right here. So this is the inside of the lining and this is the right side. So I want right sides to right sides of this bottom. Now I've already top stitched down the collar and down the side. All that's left is this right here and we are done. So I'm just going to go along here and pin. So in the center back right here, I'm going to leave an opening, and this is where I'm going to turn my entire quilt coat through this hole, and then we're going to fold that down and stitch that up and put a nice top stitch around the bottom. To help me remember that, I'm going to take and put one pin and another pin, and I'm going to make an X out of those pins, just like that. Okay, let me sew that up. It's almost time for the big reveal, and I am super excited. Now this quilt coat, it grew on me. Let's talk about it. Here it is, friends. What do you all think? Oh my word. Is this not the most darling coat ever? It was touch and go for me whether or not I was going to really like this coat and actually wear this coat. You know, it kind of looked a little circus theme there midway when I was looking at it up here on my design wall, looking at like the pieces of the coat. I have to tell you, it grew on me and now I absolutely love it. It's so cozy. When it gets really cold out, I can lift up the collar just like so. And keep that wind right out. I'm super excited, can you tell? I have a message for my ride or die subscribers. Those are the ones who always watch my video, no matter what the topic. Here's the thing. Let's make my vintage feedsack quilt coat go viral. Now, how would you do that? All you have to do is share it on Facebook, Instagram, or share it with a friend, copy the link, text it to a friend. Let's see how far we can get my vintage feedsack quilt coat around the internet. This was major fun. I hope you make one too. If you do, be sure and email me at thesewingchannel33@gmail.com. Until next time on The Sewing Channel, take care.